Yeah, hiring for Android. Woo. So, no, that is not working. It might not be, even this thing isn't working. So I'm just going to do this. Okay, cool. So, hiring for Android. Hiring only the best. How do you do that? Don't. When we hear this a lot as an expression, we hire only the best. When we hear this, what do we think of? Why do we have this expression? Well, usually it's because we've heard of these legendary creatures called ninja devs. They have been, I mean, one of them might have been hacking the Pentagon when he was 14. They can solve any problem or debug anything, regardless of the platform, regardless of the framework that they're working in. That's one of the things that we think of when we think of hiring only the best. Here's a challenge with that. Let's say you hire an Android dev who's been doing this for about 8 years. They're very good at it. He or she is very good at it and knows all the ins and outs of Android. So you hire this person, hoping that this is going to be a ninja dev, and you put this person on the only task that you have available, which is creating recycler views and filling them with images that are downloaded from the web. What's going to happen? Well, I can tell you what's going to happen because I've seen this happen on 3 different occasions, and it's been the same every time. First, he or she will get bored, but won't tell anybody. Then he's going to start making a recycler view library that manages the pagination and makes sure that the view holders are created automatically, and so you don't have to worry about it. You just have to implement this one method here, etc. Now, the challenge with this, even though it's well-intentioned, is that the person who created this is only doing it because he or she is bored. So he or she is not intending to maintain the library. And it's not paradigmatic, which means that new developers will not know how to work with this. What if you just hired a junior or intermediate developer for that same job? For somebody for whom recycler views are still exciting and still an opportunity for growth. How would that work? I guess what I'm saying is you're not looking for a good dev, you're looking for a good fit. Now, good fit is an abstract term. It's a vague term, so it's worth nailing this down. The fact is, it matters. It depends specifically on your company, the role that you're hiring for, the time that you're hiring for. So it's going to be unique to yourself. But there are some ways of determining this, what exactly a good fit is. I've read a lot of stuff online, a lot of blogs that talk about this. One of the ways that you could determine this is ask yourself who does well in your company. What do they do that is good? Get some more of those. Or what's missing? What's a common problem that keeps on coming up in your company that no one seems to solve? Maybe your deployments always keep crashing. Maybe you need somebody who has a particular skill that's related to that. And it may not necessarily even be technical. It could be something more people-related. Maybe your meetings go nowhere. Maybe you need someone who has the skills to mediate meetings. Maybe your graphics aren't great, so you need somebody who has expertise in graphics. Whatever it is specific to your task. Now, if you go down that path and start wondering what's missing in my company, and you find that you can't think of anything specific, there's a good chance, A, maybe you haven't researched hard enough, or it could be that you don't need any special particular skill. And therefore, trying to find someone with some particular unique skill is not really worth your time. Maybe what you need is a standard intermediate Android developer. And you don't need to specify more than that. Another thing to mention is make sure that the requirements that you're gathering, in a sense, for this developer, make sure that includes the other perspective as well. In other words, will this person get along in the environment of your company? In other words, for instance, is your environment fast-paced? Is it hectic? Is it loud? Or is it quiet, subdued? Whatever it is, will this person enjoy it? Because not only do you want to make sure that you want them or you need their particular skills, But you want to make sure that they also enjoy working at your place. And just because you accept them doesn't mean that they're going to accept accept the offer in return. So that's another consideration to take into account. And I'm going to talk about how you get them to accept later on. So I mentioned a few of the things that you might want to consider before you're going down this path. Another thing to consider is not every dev, in fact, no dev is going to have all the required skills for your project. So you accept that some of the skills they have to have going in, and some of the skills they will gain over time, or some of the knowledge they will gain over time, over the long term. And that's okay. So you're really only focusing on what they need to have coming in. The rest of it, they'll probably learn. If you place your standards too high, you might risk filtering out people who would have been great developers. This is kind of the point that I'm getting at. Make sure that you know what you're looking for, and make sure that your standards aren't so crazy high that you're filtering out people who would have done well in that position. So all of this is going towards writing the job description. This is one tip that I'll give about writing a job description. Put it in terms of what their impact is going to be. This is just kind of a sales tip. Don't put it in terms of what you need from them, especially if it's that specific. For instance, looking for a senior Android developer with experience using media control APIs and XO Player. Put it in terms of what they're going to be doing, how they're going to be helping the customer. As a senior Android developer, you'll enable customers to watch their favorite films offline anytime they want. These kind of say similar things. If you need a particular library, if you need a particular API, and that for some reason is absolutely necessary for you, you can put that in later as well. I actually personally, when I was hiring at Stack, I tried to avoid being that specific. But it may be that these might be your requirements. So about that, these are some tips that I would offer. A lot of people put 5 years of Android experience or some other specific number. Why do we do that? Well, there's an impression that someone who's been working in Android for 5 years probably has some level of skill, whatever that means. And that's what we're proxying for. The problem is that some people who have been working in Android for 5 years or been developing Android for 5 years aren't that great. And some people who've been developing for only 2 years might be really excellent, maybe because they were working on another platform before and skills transferred over. So I guess what I'm saying is 5 years doesn't tell you actually anything useful, and it potentially filters out honest people who are good. So why not just ask for specifically what you're asking for? I placed, again, because Android hiring is a competitive market, I placed the standards pretty low and then used the interview process to filter out. Because you don't want to filter out honest people who just feel like they don't actually fit the criteria. I've seen this kind of thing too. 2 delivered apps. Why 2? Yeah.
The previous slide, not this one. First point. Yeah.
Oh, yes, potentially. Now, yes, potentially. If you need more skills, you can add those in specifically. So this slide, just going back to it. Now, I trusted, and I was correct in trusting, that people who don't know how to develop for Android or have been only doing it for 1 month, especially since there was a little bit more to this, will automatically self-filter. I don't want to filter them before they decide to filter. The whole goal of this is making sure that your standards aren't so high that you actually knock out people who could have been good devs. Furthermore, actually, I should have mentioned this. You may not necessarily even need Android development expertise here. Maybe you're okay with them learning. This actually happened when I was at Stack. I hired someone for a Node position who had never done Node, but he was a good PHP developer, and I figured he'd gain those skills. And he did over 3 months, and he became an excellent developer. So it's up to you where you exactly want to place your criteria. Just make sure that you know what you're asking for. That's the one. That's what I'm focusing on. So yeah, for this one, I got a resume from somebody who had uploaded more than 20 apps, and they were all crap. They were all beginner. Why deliver 2 apps specifically? Maybe what we're asking for here is they know how to upload things to the Play Store. Well, if that's the case, put that in. Be specific. Oh, no. Another one, 3 years of experience with Kotlin. What if I've done it 1 day a year for 3 years? Does it count? What's the threshold? Well, that doesn't necessarily give you any useful information. Can write Kotlin and explain its benefits. Now, I'm sensing from what you said, and maybe what you guys are worried about is you're going to get a lot of people who don't necessarily have the required skills. Now, either you can put those required skills as additional stuff, but be specific, not just number of years, or you can filter them out in the interview process. You actually don't get that many people applying. So you might as well, I mean, this is Android specific. Once you put that up there, you're going to get resumes. Again, I would recommend not reading too much into what's in the resume. Some people suck at writing resumes. Look for some particular things, some Android project, oh, he's done that or she's done that, et cetera. That's good enough. Let's get them in. Because some people are great at writing resumes, but not that good at dev, and vice versa. So I wouldn't try and read them like tea leaves and trying to determine what particular keywords indicate whether or not somebody is good, because they may not know to use those keywords, or some might. So at this point, now you're going to start bringing them in. Hold on, just one second. Yeah, so now you start bringing them in. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that tech interviews in general tend to be so-so predictors of actual performance. And part of that is because it doesn't just matter what skills somebody has, it also matters the management when they actually get in and the team that they're working in. It's worth mentioning that, which is why you might sense that I wasn't putting, this is reflective of what I was actually doing. I wasn't putting too much emphasis on trying to find some particular skill that a person has that indicates that they're so great. But we're gonna bring them in. So now comes the actual interview. Let's say you're the generic case, you want a strong Android developer, or some level of Android development experience. But you don't want a dud. So you gotta find some shortcut for determining whether or not someone is an experienced developer. And let's just say intermediate at this point. So what can we do? Well, maybe we can ask some Android-specific questions. That could be a shortcut for it, and stuff that only Android developers would know. So if we ask these questions and they are able to answer them, maybe we can determine that this person is actually an Android developer. No. I hope they don't have internet. So that's page 9 of search results on Google, and it's still relevant. What I'm getting at is this is an entire industry of people trying to hack the Android interview experience. I guess what I'm saying is Android tests are gameable. When you ask problems that are trivia, basically, do you know the answer to this? You're creating an antagonistic situation where I am the person who's testing you, and you are trying to beat my test. This is problematic for many reasons. One of them is, as you saw, people who are candidates are far more motivated to beat your test than you are to create a test that they can't beat, because their job is on the line. So this is a game that you're probably going to lose. That's one of the problems. The other one is that it selects for people who are deceptive. In other words, people who are willing to go out and find these kinds of resources and train for the interview are probably more, like an honest person may say, I'm just gonna go with what I have, versus I'm gonna try and train for these kinds of questions. And so you're more likely to get people who are deceptive get through the test than people who are honest. A similar scenario actually happened to me recently where it was a take-home test. And we were supposed to take home this code thing, create the code, and send it back, and the person said, spend only 3 hours on it. I mean, somebody who is deceptive will spend 10 hours and say 3 hours, and will probably do better than someone who is honest. That's the kind of game situation that you might potentially be creating, and it's problematic. So that's what I'm trying to avoid. So if that's the case, how do we determine if somebody is, quote unquote, a good developer? We've got to find something.
GitHub.
My GitHub sucks. It's got one library in it that I created. It was a lot of work, but you don't necessarily know. They could have been working on private projects for a long time. Let's answer this by going at it from a slightly different angle. Let's say the purple rectangle represents everything there is to know about Android, and the green circle represents what you know about Android. Any question that you ask that has a right answer that you know is going to fall in this circle somewhere, right? That's pretty simple. What happens when someone comes along whose knowledge is something like this? Now, what does this mean? If you're a senior developer or an experienced developer, it's very easy to think that the way that you solve problems, the approach that you take, is the best approach to take. It's worth considering that there are many, many, many ways that you don't even know of solving the same problems that you solve, and you think that you know the best way of doing it. For instance, in the circles that I run in or code in, the Square libraries are considered to be the apex of Android development. Oh, so much so that it might be tempting to say that someone who doesn't know what they are or doesn't use them can't be a good developer or can't be a good Android developer. But there are a lot of companies who have Android developers who don't allow them to use third-party libraries at all for security reasons. There are good developers at those companies too, but they take a different approach than the one that you're familiar with. I've also just met people who I thought were good developers who said they don't use third-party libraries because it creates bloat. That's also a legitimate way. It's a legitimate way of doing things. There are more ways of doing things than you can think. And if you start filtering out people based on what you know, based on the kind of questions that you ask, you risk creating this kind of team where everyone is just a clone of you. There's no diversity in this thinking. You're missing out on all these other possibilities, all those different ways of thinking. So that you're going to get a homogeneous team, and you don't want that. You want more diversity. So how to do that? How to solve that? How to get some more different ways of thinking about things? This is what I consider to be the golden rule of Android interviewing, or dev interviewing in general. Only ask questions that have many right answers. This is a universal rule that I have never found an exception for. Always ask questions that have multiple correct answers. Because that's the only way that you're going to learn something potentially new. In fact, this reminds me when we gather around our team would gather together and decide whether or not we're going to accept or reject somebody. We'd be given a form. And one of the questions on the form was, did you learn anything new? And if so, what? The goal of that was to make sure that you're not just asking, trying to determine, does this person know all the things that I know? It's, are you actually opening your mind to different ways of thinking? Is this person going to bring a different contribution, a new contribution of their own to the company and expand the knowledge base? The other benefit of that is from the other perspective. If you start asking questions that are open-ended and you're listening to the person's answers, then the person will feel like, wow, this is a company, the candidate will feel like this is a company where they respect different opinions, where they're open to different ways of doing things. This seems like the kind of company that I might want to work at. So what are some ways of doing this? Some specific examples. For instance, here's a closed-ended question, or here's a question with one right answer. What is a service that has one right answer into the documentation? So how do you turn this into a more open-ended question? Well, always ask yourself, why am I asking this question? What is relevant to me about this question? Well, services are used for background processes. A different process to make sure that there's a persistent background process running a particular task. Okay, so why don't I ask, how would you manage background tasks? Note, I didn't even include persistent different process here. I kept it open. Now, if you need to focus in a little bit about that, then you can feel free to do so. But the more you focus in, the more that you're closing in the space of right answers. You get different perspectives this way. Another thing could be, this is a closed-ended question. It's the most closed-ended. It's yes, no. Have you used Room? You're not really getting much information about this. And the problem with yes, no questions is there's always one right answer, and it's always very obvious what it is. It's yes in this case, right? Even if it's actually no. So what information can I get out of this particular question? Why not rephrase it? How would you store app data? Keep it open to different possibilities, different ways of doing things. Sometimes it can be hard to turn a closed-ended question into an open-ended one. One phrase that I find is really useful, I use this all the time, I have in my back pocket, it's what's your experience with? If ever you're having difficulty converting a question, this is a useful one to use. For instance, you might say, did you implement network security? Well, of course, there's one right answer to that, which is yes. Just turn into, what's your experience implementing network security? Just rephrase it using that. Sometimes it'll sound awkward, but it's way better than the alternative because you'll get more information. That's the whole point of all this. So the goal of everything that I've said so far is that you shouldn't ask questions, you should ask questions that they can't Google. If a person can Google the answer to a particular question that you're asking, you shouldn't be asking in an interview because they could have Googled it while they were actually on the job. There's no reason for you to actually ask it. In fact, you know what? I'll mention that later. This is the kind of thing, this is the way that I think about these particular kind of problems. Imagine that the skills that a person has are like a landscape. If you ask questions that have a narrow scope, the narrower the scope you ask, it's like narrowing the window of what you're looking at. You don't get to see their actual depth of understanding. And that was the whole goal of all this, to determine what kind of developer that they are. The point is that you're trying to get them to redirect you towards what they know, what they actually have deep knowledge in, and not just keeping that narrow that window closed. And this is when we're kind of stepping into a territory of what kind of developer somebody is. In other words, in the broad sense of the term. And so we're going to have to talk about Whiteboard. Now, just to start, I think that they can be used effectively. There's some controversy about Whiteboards. I think a lot of developers, especially candidates, have this same perspective on Whiteboards. This was a tweet that went viral a few years ago. Yeah, many of you already read it. So Max Howell is the creator of Homebrew, and he got rejected from Google. Apparently, says 90% of Google is saying 90% of our engineers use the software you wrote, Homebrew, but you can't invert a binary tree on a whiteboard, so fuck off. So the problem here is that a lot of developers feel that they're arbitrary. So how do we make them not arbitrary? How do we make them actually effective? Now I'm going to approach this from a slightly different direction. These are some logical puzzles that I'm familiar with. This one's called a nonogram. I don't know if you guys have ever done it. The way it works is those numbers indicate the groups of black dots in that particular column. Same thing with the rows, and you're supposed to fill them in. This is a completed one. You're supposed to fill them in based on those numbers. It's a logical puzzle. One of the cool things that you find about this puzzle, if you've ever done it, is the more you do of these puzzles, the better you get at solving nonograms. Same thing with knights and knaves. You're probably familiar with it. Knights always tell the truth, knaves always lie. Usually this is a family of problems where you meet a group, somebody says something, you're supposed to determine who's what. Again, they're logical puzzles. And again, if you do knights and knaves kind of problems, you get better at doing knights and knaves problems over time. This is an actual whiteboard interview, a whiteboard question that is used by Eric Ries, who is the author of Lean Startup. Yes, thanks. Lean Startup. So the way it goes is you've got a grid and a center point and a radius, and you're supposed to figure out which pixels would make a circle for this, like which pixels you would actually fill in. Now, personally, I have had a lot of experience with 2D graphics and 3D graphics also. So I'd find this relatively easy. Someone who has some experience, for instance, with planar geometry, 2D planar geometry, might find this okay. Someone who has no experience with any of those would probably find this difficult. So what am I getting at? If you're given a whiteboard problem, how good you are or how successful you are at doing it is directly related to whether or not you've done that problem before. And we know this from our personal experience. As interviewers, if we've given a whiteboard problem many times, you'll find that over time, we get better at answering it. We get better at solving it, considering all the edge cases, all the preconditions, et cetera. So is it because we got better at problem solving? Or is it because we became more of a logical thinker? No, it's because we've just done it. We've had exposure to it. And the closer the exposure that we have to that particular kind of problem, the better we do in terms of solving a whiteboard problem, especially when we're being compared against other people who are solving that same problem. All you're getting out of this is whether or not whether or not they're good problem solvers, but whether or not they've had experience with this kind of this particular problem before. So that sounds a little bit negative. So is there any way to use this effectively then? Well, now that we know what we're getting out of it, make sure that the questions that you ask are relevant to the work that the person's going to be doing. Remember, there is no particular question, there's no question that is a wrong question, at least the ones we've discussed so far, that is wrong to ask. The whole point of everything that I've said so far is that you clarify what you're trying to discover, what you're trying to find in the candidates, and make sure that the questions that you're asking are relevant to finding out that information. So whatever questions meet these criteria are fine. If you need some specific knowledge, then that's the kind of thing that you ask. Here's some examples. For instance, let's say you work at Snapchat. It's very high level, this one. So how would you cache images on device while keeping them private? Draw a flow diagram. That's relevant to the work that somebody's going to be doing. In fact, I remember that Eric, when he was interviewing me at Shopify, gave me, what he did for the coding challenge, which is similar to a whiteboard problem, is he took some of the code that he was working on, ripped out a section. He was working on for work, ripped out a section and said, we're going to fill this in together. That's pretty relevant. That's pretty pertinent. And you make sure that you're not going off in all different directions. Let's say Netflix. These are stuff that I came up with. How would you ensure that offline videos can't be pirated? Now, one of the benefits of another benefit of these kinds of questions is they obey the golden rule. They have multiple possible answers. And this rule is especially important for whiteboard problems, because whiteboard problems can be incredibly anxiety-inducing, especially for people who aren't confident. Remember, you're basically being judged. Every one of your actions, thoughts, decisions is being judged by a stranger you never met, and your job is on the line. These are not the normal conditions under which we solve problems. It can be even worse sometimes if the person is trying to get you to guess the particular answer, the particular solution that they have in their own mind. That can be even more stressful. And a lot of people, especially shy people, will just seize up. They'll freeze. Because like 90%, like roughly 90% of their brain is being used to solve the social problem of being judged and evaluated, and only 10% is left to actually solve the problem that they're being given. And that's exactly the opposite of what you want. You don't want the person to, you don't want to hide their best. You want to bring out their best. The goal is to make sure that the person feels as confident as possible. Whatever you can do to make them feel confident, because you want to see their best. That's what they're going to be bringing to the job. And make sure that social considerations or stress doesn't get in the way. I would use a few tactics when I was doing whiteboard problems at Shopify. One of them was I would make sure that I clearly emphasize beforehand that there are many possible solutions to this. I haven't found most of them. Maybe we'll discover a new one together. Cool. Another one that I would do, and this was if I wanted to go a step further, was I would take the problem, not solve it. Go into the room and say, here's the problem. I haven't solved this, we're going to solve it together. Whatever I can do to make the person feel as confident as possible. The goal is to bring out their best. If we're trying to determine what kind of developer somebody is, we're trying to gauge the depth of their knowledge, wherever that depth happens to be, that is the best way to do it. And another way, and this is a tool that I can't recommend enough. This is the single tool that I always use, regardless. Because I feel like, in my opinion, it gives you the best information, is called the deep dive. This is definitely the one. If I had to recommend one thing, this would be the one. For those of you, I first discovered it or encountered it when I was at Shopify, but I've seen other companies do it too, like Snapchat especially. So the way deep dive works is you ask the person to think of some problem, some difficult project that they worked on that they'd like to talk about in depth, and make sure that they know beforehand that that's what you're going to do. And then you just start asking open-ended questions about it, digging deep into it. So for instance, be like, oh, I created a 3D rendering engine that's more efficient. Oh, tell me more about it. I make sure that I use native code. What kind of efficiencies did you get out of that? Well, because you don't have to go through JNF, et cetera. Well, what kind of problems did you run into, et cetera. So whatever they talk about, keep digging in. Just ask open-ended questions. Be curious. Also, be humble. You are the student. They're the teacher. Make sure that you give that impression. You're not telling them what to do. You're saying that you're teaching me. The benefits of this, huge. Everything that I've discussed so far, basically. One of them is, I found that even shy people, if they are talking about something that they're interested in, they're passionate about, and that they know more about than you do. I don't know if I mentioned this, by the way. It doesn't have to be Android related. It can be any software, any kind of software related. For instance, 3D engines, like I talked about. So anyways, when they know that they know more about it than you, and that is something that they're passionate about, even shy people, I find, start to come out of their shell. The other benefit of this is, remember at the beginning I said that Android tests are like games, basically. What you're competing with the other person. They're trying to break your test. In this situation, you're both working together for a common goal. You're both trying to bring out the best in the person. You're both trying to see the best parts of this person's skills. So it's not a competition anymore. It's actually cooperation. And the benefit of that is if you've done it effectively and the person has brought out their best, if you happen to later reject them, the person is more likely to feel like it was fair. Because they said, well, I did my best. So I did my best. They still didn't accept me. Well, maybe it wasn't a good fit. It feels more fair. That's the reason why I really, really emphasize these. So now, this is the question part. Now you got to actually pick whether or not you're going to accept or reject them. And you've got to tell them this. The critical moment, basically, the big decision. And I call this defining your culture. And you'll see why. This particular decision, defining your culture. Let me ask a question. Is it possible to reject a candidate and still have them recommend your company and speak highly of it? Some yes? Depends on the person. Well, that's also true. So at least there's some knowledge about that it's possible. Now, I would say that there might be some skepticism about this. I'm not sure that there is, partly because many of us don't necessarily do that. When we actually, like in experience, we don't necessarily do that. My hypothesis about this is it's something to do with this particular sentence. We decided not to go ahead with your application. I don't know about you, but this, just hearing the sentence or reading it gives me like a cold chill down my spine. And no matter how many times I read it, this is the feeling that I get. I think part of it has to do with the fact that no one likes to be rejected. You know, everyone wants to feel wanted. The other part, I would say, might have to do with this. Why? No answer. I think the problem with this kind of experience is when you're not getting a particular answer as to what was wrong or what was missing, it feels like you might as well be talking to a machine. And in my humble opinion, or to put it another way, it sort of is that way. And what do I mean by that? Let me phrase it a different way. We in our, let's say, technological corporate society feel like a company is a machine, a giant machine that we're a part of. And so, like, the reason why we can actually do this, the reason we can feel comfortable not answering, is because when a person gets rejected, we feel like it's not us that's rejecting them, it's the machine. Sorry, what was I saying about that? Oh yeah, it's not us rejecting them, it's the machine rejecting them. The machine didn't need their skills. And so we don't necessarily owe them an explanation, or the machine doesn't necessarily owe them an explanation as to why that is. I don't actually, it's worth asking, how many of you have gotten an answer as to why? 1.5, 2, 2.5.
When they give you an answer, they give you like a general generic answer, so not a specific answer.
Not a specific answer as to what you're missing.
Applies to your application. See?
Yeah. So
they would say, you just, we're looking for somebody a little bit more experience, like a general,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like nothing specific applies to your.
Yeah. So can I ask a question about that? Which is, how did you feel about that company afterwards?
Well, The thing is, if you fill in my body's application, you sure so
It becomes noise. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you actually got to that stage. To me, it's still not noise.
You enjoy the process. And like in your experience, does your company endorse you providing responses, like valid responses?
So that's sort of what I'm getting at, which is yes, that's exactly what I did. And the responses that I got were, well, of course, devs really appreciate that, or the candidates always appreciate that. So the whole goal is not just to like have them be okay with it, or at least to brush it off, but to actually think that your company is respectable, to raise the esteem of your company. In other words, tell other people, wow, that company is a company that I actually want to work for again. Reapply and not be stressed out about it. And I think not giving an answer plays a huge role as to why we don't have a high esteem of a particular company. In fact, so this happened to me a little while ago. Might as well mention it since you guys are talking about it. A company that I really respected. I went and applied, and the person told me during the interview what was missing. Since then, I've kept hammering away at them, trying to get another interview, trying to get another job in a different position, maybe one that's not quite so high, or that I was trying to aim for. And the purpose of that is I had a newfound respect for the person's skills, for their person's ability, that they were willing to be honest with me, they were willing to be brave, and not just hide behind the machine of a company. Because I think all of us find it a little uncomfortable to tell people what's missing. And that's why it's okay to just hide behind the machine.
In some instances, like I've interviewed people before, and like the company instructs you not to tell them what.
Yes.
For liability.
So I'm glad you brought that up. I wasn't necessarily going to bring it up, but that is another thing that I've heard, which is that for liability reasons, I'm going to go so far as to say that has no legs. There is nothing there. So what I've heard, especially when I talk to some people who are more in management positions, is if you tell people what's missing, then they can later come back and say, well, I've gained these skills, and therefore you owe me a job, legally speaking, or something like that. That's a liability thing. I think that is, totally without legs, in the sense that almost nobody's going to do that. No developer's going to do that, because why would they antagonize the company they're about to come into? Secondly, if somebody does do that, yeah, why not? Did you? So let me go on a little bit further. The whole point of this, and I'll mention this in a sec. The whole point of this is we tend to hide behind the machine and say we don't owe this person an explanation because legally speaking, the machine doesn't owe them an explanation, and maybe it's a liability for us. Therefore, we're just going to push it off. What if we treated people like human beings? That's the goal of what I was trying to say, which is, what if we talked about it like people talking to other people, or human beings talking to other people? So we might explain why the person's missing, if we were actually talking about it as though it was another human being. Or in addition, we might give them a set of, a set of things that they can do to improve if they decide to. That's another thing that we might do if we're talking to them like human beings. Go ahead.
The other thing is that it's an opportunity to show how the company deals with delivering constructive feedback.
You're killing my punchline here, but yeah.
Sorry,
but yes.
It's just that one of the hardest things for a manager to do is to communicate a lack of ability. And then if you could, and the other thing is the person's just invested time. They've invested time and they haven't been given any feedback back, so they're not going to grow from that iteration.
Exactly. So yeah, that's another thing why this whole radio silence thing is frustrating, is because you don't know how to improve next time around. But what if you do give them feedback? In fact, what if you treat it like they're an actual employee, and that you're giving them feedback on how they can improve? So this may or may not be your experience, but I'll tell you what my experience has been specifically when it comes to not getting an answer. When I find that when I don't get an answer as to what was missing, I have one of two feelings. One of them is those people don't know what they're doing. They can't see good things when it's right in front of their face, or maybe there was some bias there. They only pick their friends or that kind of thing. Another reaction that I might have is, oh, maybe if I had only answered that one question a completely different way, then maybe they would have accepted me. And all these things are going through a person's mind, but they have no real feedback, like you said, as to what exactly it is that they could improve. It's just a one-shot loss for them. So a huge part of this, a huge part of actually giving feedback is fairness. If you're rejecting somebody or you're accepting somebody, how do you know that you've been fair? If you're just basing it on a gut instinct, like this is what I feel like, or this person feels like a developer or a good developer, something like that, how do you know that that's actually, the values that are informing that are actually worthwhile values? So the benefit of writing why is not only to clarify it for the person, like feedback, but also to clarify it for yourself and to make sure that the reasons that you have for rejecting somebody are good ones. So I'm actually going to give an example of email that I would send out so that you can at least have some sense of like the details of it. I would start something like this. Hi, Smesh. Thanks for coming to chat today. I don't believe you are right for the role of Android developer at DEFCO. So two things to note about this one. First, put the rejection at the very top. Don't hide it, because that feels a little weaselly, or it feels like you're trying to get out of it, or you're not confident. Another thing is, going back to the treating people like human beings thing versus a machine, is I use I and not we. Just thought, that one you can take or leave, but I find that actually it makes sure that I'm taking responsibility for it. Then I explain what was missing. Although you showed a strong grasp of fundamental Android concepts such as activities and views, I'm looking for someone with more experience designing modular and decoupled code, as well as a deeper understanding of networking protocols. So this would be the why. And this is similar to the kind of stuff that I would write when I was rejecting a candidate. And I did this dozens of times, basically. And like you said, this is like feedback that you might be giving to somebody. And it also has some positive as well as negative things that are lacking. Helping them actually improve. If you'd like to improve, I recommend writing larger projects with more moving parts. Doing so, you'll likely encounter problems due to the growing complexity of the code base. Addressing and solving such problems will give you a better understanding of how to write modular code. I also suggest working with networking libraries like Retrofit and Volley and dealing with threading, scheduling, and error checking. I hope this helps, and good luck in your search. This helps the person actually improve and take the next steps. Every developer I've talked to about this really appreciates it. In fact, how would you feel if you got an email like this, as opposed to just a single line saying we decided not to go ahead? Feels kind of good. Feels like you're talking to a human being. I would also suggest doing this even for people to accept. Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming to chat today. I'd love to have you join our team as an Android developer. Your in-depth understanding of the JNI and long experience writing native C++ libraries will be a great addition to our team and our product. In addition, the care with which you approach unit testing will help keep our code base stable and easy to maintain over the long run. I look forward to hearing from you and to discuss when you can come aboard. So why do this for people who are also accepting? Well, for one thing, everyone likes to feel appreciated for the actual skills that they have. It's concrete feedback as to what they're doing that's right. It also makes it seem at least a little bit objective that you've made some decision based on what they actually had, and not just because we like you. The third and maybe the most important reason is you've set the person off on the right foot. Now, this person doesn't know what skills they had that you appreciated, that your company would want. It might seem obvious to you, but it's not necessarily obvious to them. There are many different companies, and they have many different requirements, or many different things that they want. Some people request diligence. Some people want people who have velocity and that kind of thing. So that person coming into the company doesn't know what it is that you appreciate about them. And this will make sure that they focus on the stuff that they actually do appreciate. In fact, they tell managers, whenever somebody gets hired, the first day you should tell them what your expectations are. The goal is to make sure that they're heading in the right direction, because it's not necessarily obvious. This just gets a head start on that and makes the person feel appreciated. And regardless of which email you send, tell them quickly. I can't stress this enough. I used to send the email day of or at most 2 days after. Tell them quickly. Don't wait. Don't look for somebody better. If this person actually meets your requirements, hire them. It's a competitive market when you're hiring for Android. It's a competitive market when you're hiring for Android. This actually happened to a friend of mine who was applying at many different places. He was a good developer. He had lots of skills. Great catch for anybody. And he applied to 2 different companies. I happened to be working at company 2 at the time. Now, before company 2 even brought him in for an interview, company 1 brought him in for an interview and wrote up a contract and sent it to him. In addition, they put a time limit on the contract saying you have to answer within 7 days. It's like a ticking bomb type contract. I don't recommend that. I think it's unethical. The reason they did that was to make sure that he doesn't go anywhere else, that he doesn't look around anywhere else. If he hasn't even got a response from company 2, so far as he knows, they're not interested. And so he goes, bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. I might as well go with this company. That's the kind of competitive landscape that you're talking about. So be quick, be careful. If you want to build the team that you actually want to build, with the members that you actually want, you're going to have to put in this work. They say that, for instance, managers are supposed to spend most of their time, or our highest priority is supposed to be hiring. I think that's probably also true of teams as well. But you got to put in the work, and you got to make sure that your interview process is as objective as possible, as punctual as possible, as respectful of their time, because the interview is the first impression that somebody has of your company, and possibly the only impression that they have of your company. Just as you're judging them, they're judging you. They're trying to get a sense of what kind of culture you have as a company. And so you may accept them, but they may not necessarily accept you back. And that's what I mean by when I say defining the culture. The culture of a company is like its character. It's the way that things are done. It's the assumptions that people have in their mind. It's the way that people think about these problems. And so the question is, what kind of impression are you sending about your culture to the candidates? Are you, for instance, making sure that they know, like, are you the kind of culture, for instance, that respects people's time? Are you the kind of culture that is diligent and makes sure that they're being objective about their decisions? In other words, basing it on data. Are you the kind of culture that is open to hearing new ideas and new contributions from outside the team? Are you the kind of culture that treats people like human beings? I mean, all of these things are going to come off, and even though it's a lot of work, everything that I talked about, or at least it's more work than normally people put into interviews, it pays off massively in the end, because you're defining your culture. And ultimately, there's no shortcut to defining great culture. So, thanks. Now, I'm glad that there was a lot of opinions about this, because I'm sensing that there's going to be a good conversation at this point. Does anybody have any first thoughts?
What role would you say your instinct has in interviewing people?
It's problematic, and it's something that I can't rely on. A huge part, a huge part of that is that instincts or gut feelings are based on internalized values, but you're not quite sure which values that they're going to be based on. I ignore it as much as possible and try to base it on some actual kind of requirements that I've set up. By the way, everything that I've described here, I did when I was at Stack, every last bit of it. So it's doable. Yeah. So, but
What's your opinion on pair programming?
Pair programming, you mean once somebody starts working?
No.
Or
During the interview.
during the interview. Pair programming is essentially the same, or very similar to a whiteboard problem. Pair programming challenges, whiteboard problems, they're basically trying to do something during the interview that shows that you can solve some problem. Pair programming might be in some ways better if the person has an IDE to work with. It might also focus on some tiny minutia that aren't necessarily worth focusing on. It's a trade-off. You're still, like, for instance, one of the benefits of pair programming is you know that the person can actually code in that language, if that is a requirement that you have. If you don't necessarily care that the person can program in that language, maybe it's not a requirement. The whole point of this is trying to determine what you actually care about, what is the minimum requirements of getting somebody in the door, and then what's the word? And then basing your questions, whatever they are, on that decision and making sure that you get that information. So yes, like when Eric did it, I thought it was useful within a certain context. I also wouldn't read too much into it again because of the nervousness thing.
I thought your email example was really great, but would you care to try to write it for your possible and so on?
So, yeah.
Get kind of feel that.
So, yeah, good question. So you're saying that would you rephrase it differently if it was a culture problem? So I have done that. Now here's the thing. When we say, you may have noticed that I did not use the word culture fit anywhere in here. That was explicit. Because I think the word culture fit or the phrase culture fit is too vague and it invites potentially homogenized thinking or homogeneous thinking. That's why you have to split up culture fit into a few different categories. One is, will they, like what about the work will they enjoy, about the process? Like in other words, will they like the hectic atmosphere? But that's for them to decide, and that's for you to simply tell them. The other part of culture fit, which I think you're kind of teasing at, is what if they're an asshole? That's a possibility, right? Now, if they've done something that was explicitly rude during the interview, which happened to me once, I do put that in. Because it's explicit and it's concrete and it's detailed. The person showed up late and then made excuses for it, which were lies. I knew that they were lies. So I did express that to them because that's feedback that they might appreciate. And the person actually did thank me for it because maybe they've never heard that before. Now, the other part is, what if I don't like the person? That's where you get into dangerous territory, right? Because here's my opinion about this, and you can debate if you like. I actually don't think that there is such a thing as an asshole. It's context and circumstance that make one person who would be great in one context, you know, a hero, and another context seem like a jerk or an asshole. That's why it's important to not just say this person is or is not an asshole. A huge part of whether or not a team gets along happens after the person actually joins. How the team is managed. Are people open to new ideas? Are people polite with one another? That kind of thing. Those are the stuff that's going to bring out the quote-unquote asshole or not. It's not something that you can determine from an interview. In fact, assholes will hide it pretty well during the interview. So it's not a useful thing to be looking for. Does that answer?
Right? It's something that just comes up sometimes. So just might think that someone is very opinionated, right? And you're actually looking for someone that is open for new ideas.
Oh, what you mean is that they won't listen to other people's ideas? How do you know that? Did they interrupt you? Worth mentioning that.
Right? So you suggested an option or some discussion for pros and cons. And
yep.
Like, oh, no, this is how I do it, this is how I should do it.
That's good feedback to give. Remember, think of it like you're a manager. Maybe many of you aren't necessarily managers or haven't done management, but feedback can be of any kind. It's anything that, the way feedback works is, this is what you did, this is the effect that it had on me, this is the experience that I had. It's something very specific and concrete, not just generally you do X. And so think of it in those same ways when you're writing that feedback. And like I said, I've done it, if need be. You look like you had a hand, and well, go on.
Well, I'm scratching my head, but
yeah.
What I really like about what you're saying is that it's challengeable. If you're transparent about the decision making, and the person could potentially come back and say, "I don't agree with you." And you have to justify why you're making that decision. And if you've actually been explicit, and then he can come back and say, "Well, actually, I disagree because of this, this, and this." Actually revisit your hiring process, actually kind of dialogue.
That's true. It cuts off dialogue, and that's the whole radio silence thing. In fact, one of the best uses that I found of giving a why is if I was interviewing somebody and I got a sense that I'm about to say no to this person in the email. Well, then I have to know that I have to know what I'm going to write in that email. I have to be explicit, and it has to sound reasonable. And oh, now that I've realized what I'm about to say, let me make sure that this person actually lacks it. So you can ask questions so that make sure that, okay, yeah, I was right, or maybe I was wrong. I didn't think too much about this. And I mentioned in the interview where the person said no to me, and they went further and they told me in the interview, at the end of the interview, which I thought was great because you don't wait any time. But I also noticed that the reason they gave, they had asked about right before. And it's true, I hadn't actually answered it well. I hadn't given any good experience. So that's another benefit of giving. You're trying to be objective. You're trying to at least give some effort that you're being fair. One of the things about why do I write how you can improve? Besides the fact that it's polite or kind to the person, it also makes sure that your reasons are good reasons. They're not too vague. Because if it's something that someone can't improve because they're too vague, or maybe they're just something that a person can't improve, then maybe they're not good reasons to reject somebody. You're trying to be as objective as possible here. And you're trying to also convey that impression. Sorry, I'll get back to you. Yep.
So I'm only in my career really heard like one part of the technical interview, and so I was wondering if you had like strategies or good methods of like taking notes that are useful and helpful, because we use like a rubric, and I don't think it's the greatest way, and developers aren't always the best at like writing. So
taking notes about what happened during the interview.
Yeah, after the fact, like if I have to give that to someone else who's going to be considering that, or for documentation purposes.
I almost feel like you might be in a better position to answer this. I know I said, sorry about that. I did put you on the spot. Only because Shopify, you're still at Shopify, right? Yeah, Shopify has a much more built out, like what I'm describing is a little bit more, what's the word, ad hoc. Whereas they have, which is why I work with, have a much more thorough process because it's a much larger company. Stack was a startup. I had to build the team from scratch. So that means that most of the time I was the only one doing the interview. Do you have any thoughts?
I can only speak about my experience, and at Shopify, the interview process is constantly evolving. There's a large talent team that gets feedback from interviewers, from hiring managers to improve the process, and we also get feedback from candidates themselves. So one thing we do is for each type of interview, whether it's a pair programming or the technical deep dive, before you go into the interview, we use Lever, and there is a form that the HR team fills out with the things that you're, reminders that you're looking for. And so the technical deep dive, it was, what did the candidate choose to discuss? Did you learn anything new from this? And there's just, free form text fields to fill in. There are things like, did they respond well to feedback? So during the interview itself, these are things you're supposed to think of, and we're asked not to actually take any notes, because then it's not, you don't give the candidate your full attention, but it depends. I mean, each interview is different. I tend to take notes because I will otherwise not remember right away, but the times when I've tried not to like sit in front of them typing, immediately after the interview, I book time off so that I'm not doing anything else except trying to remember everything that just happened in the last 60 or 90 minutes, and then fill out that form with additional notes if I need to. Yervant was saying that you want to get back to the candidate as fast as possible. That's not always reality, as you probably experience. You might not come back to, afterwards we have all the people that participate in the interviews, plus the HR person. We sit in a meeting and we review everybody's feedback. But that might not happen for a week or two, and so your own personal notes help you to refresh your memory about that candidate. And then we sit together as a group and we go over those notes, and if somebody had a red flag they want to raise, it's a group decision. There's no quantitative measure that the majority of people who are in the interviewing committee have to agree, but we kind of come to a decision together.
Does that answer? Cool. Hey, Jeff.
Do you have any tips for how a candidate can help steer an interview towards something that might be considered more fair or relevant towards their skill set? Because I feel like a lot of people here might be in a position where they see this happen and they're just like, oh, what do I do now? Is there anything you've seen personally that you've been able to do to help kind of steer an interviewer towards a different avenue in that respect?
Sure. You mean like as a candidate?
As a candidate, yeah. Going in and seeing like the whiteboard thing and seeing all these things that you're just like, I want to talk about something, I want to express myself in a different way, but I don't know how to do it, other than just like interrupting them or we're just straight up answering a different question or however you do it.
So I'm going to answer that question in slightly roundabout way, and here's why. I once did an interview, a whiteboard interview, where I solved the problem correctly, and the person told me that it was incorrect, and then realized that it was correct. So what I'm getting at is, how do you disagree with the interviewer? The answer is, unless you have magical social skills, you really are shit out of luck. You can't, because you're risking insulting the person's feelings. And that's one of the reasons, so by the way, that's one of the reasons why I keep focusing on open-ended questions. Because if you have a right answer in your mind that you need this person to get, then you run the risk of being wrong. Which could be bad for you, and the person doesn't know how to deal with that situation, and you run the risk of basically the candidates can't show their best. I mean, I guess the answer to your question is, all of this is from the side of the interviewer. I mean, from an interviewee's perspective, you've got to suck it up and say, well, I got to do somewhere else.
You don't think that there's anything they could lean towards or do or bring up that would change that?
It depends on what degree the interviewer's ego is involved in this. So this is a bit of psychology, or at least armchair psychology. When an interviewer is asking questions, one of the things that they are unconscious, one of the unconscious assumptions that is in the interviewer's mind is, I work here. So there are some skills that a person needs to work here. I work here, therefore I must have those skills. Therefore, anyone who has the skills that I have must be good for working here. Conversely, maybe anyone who doesn't have them. By redirecting the flow of an interview, you are risking someone feeling like, oh, wait a second, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, maybe I don't deserve working here, and that's unlikely to resonate well inside the person's mind. This is all really doom and gloom. I wish I had a better answer for you. You know what? I'll open up. Does anybody have any thoughts? Because maybe someone else has a solution. Ruben.
So, why can't we just include the stuff that we talked about in the resume? The deep dive was the interview.
But I feel like if there's a deep dive, you're already in a better place
Yeah.
than some of these nightmare interviews start. Yeah. One time I was interviewing for a company, and it was kind of going that way. The questions were very straightforward in a way where I didn't feel like what I wanted to talk about was happening. So what I ended up doing was there was 4 people in the room, and I ended up asking each of them what they did at the company. I'm just what do you guys do for the company? And then based on their response, I was able to chime in on certain things I'd done on projects in my career that could relate to the things that they were proud of that they mentioned. And I felt that in doing that, it allowed me to relate to a whole team, people who normally might have just stayed quiet and observed were suddenly engaged with me and asking me questions that were different.
That's one thought. I mean, you sort of answered your own question. Did you have? That's good. No, I'm glad that he did, because I wouldn't have thought of that. So, I mean, if there are any other thoughts, I would like to hear them too.
Maybe you saw this person, an interviewee, flip the script in a way that you respected it and found that there was.
Oh, you mean as an
interviewer?
Oh, well, I don't think that I would have ever gotten in that situation. Hopefully I didn't, which is why I don't think I've ever seen it. Because the whole point is to get a sense of what he or she knows. I mean, the problem with, like you're saying, those questions you're talking about is that they don't give the person the opportunity to actually talk about what they know. So everything that I ask is, what do you know? Tell me as much as you can about what you know, even if it's completely different from what I expect. In some cases, actually, someone has done something differently than I would have done or disagreed with me, and I was like, cool, I got a different opinion. But I'm not every person. Yeah.
So it seems like you had a lot of different interviews,
Yep.
So I guess I'm curious as to how recently you developed this philosophy, and then how, is this something everyone, or most of the people who do interviews at your current company
Well,
do?
sorry. Oh, sorry. What what's the word? is this a new thought that I had? When did I develop these ideas? So first of all, I didn't develop all of these ideas. For one thing, that company who I haven't named yet, which I had high respect for, did most of these maybe out of instinct. Or maybe they had it as a formal system. This is basically the sum total of a hell of a lot of reading, some experience from my own life, and practical applications. To answer your question, more specifically as to where this came out or which experience started this, it was when I joined Stack and I had to build up the team. Because at that point, I felt 100% responsible for making sure that this team gelled together, making sure that this team worked together well, and that I couldn't just say, well, it wasn't me, because it was me. So it was a lot of my time, but it was important to me because the team that ultimately got built out is freaking amazing. I would easily work with that team any other place. It's one of the things that I'm most proud of. Like, I'm not saying that I'm proud of the team's work, but what I'm saying is I'm proud of the team. So I'm glad that I did this. It made my work so much easier after the fact because I didn't have to handfold people. I didn't have to manage expectations as much or manage conflicts because everyone came with the right expectations, that kind of stuff.
And is this a style that people that you work with like?
Oh, yeah, so the last question was, you would have to ask that question to people directly behind you because they are the ones that have taken up that mantle. Do you want to answer, Ruben, or?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear.
So interviews at Stack.
Yeah.
Do they still reflect this?
Yes.
Is it? Somewhat. Yeah. None of them. Yeah. No interview is completely not this, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, like when I try to do interviews, I guess one of my main philosophies is that I'm trying to teach them so that so that it doesn't feel like judgment all the time. And also is do deep dive so that it's not like I only have the mic and I'm trying to ask that question. They have the mic as well. If they can ask us a question and they can talk more about their experiences as well. So.
Does that answer?
So you ever judge candidates based on their GitHub repos?
No, not really. Again, maybe this is me being a little bit biased here, but my GitHub repo is not particularly great. Some people have worked in companies where they didn't keep the code or they didn't do open source work. I think it could be one. Like, here's the thing. To put it another way, it could go the other way, which is if someone has a great repo that is uniquely their own, and that might count towards, their skill. It's just I wouldn't disqualify somebody. You have a question?
I haven't done a lot of interview, but I have done fair bit. So I like the idea, and I do practice it, like training each person, making them feel comfortable so that they can discuss things around. And I feel like most of the time, so far I've interviewed is like 1 hour, and usually I find it very often that, if we had more time, we could discuss more. It does take time, and then like most of the time, like, we have 5 minutes, do you have any questions? Or stuff like that. What is the ideal interview time?
It's as much time as you need to get the information that you need. So sometimes I've been able to get the information within 45 minutes and then there's not that many questions afterwards. Sometimes I've asked the person to come in for another hour because I didn't do my job, basically. My job is to collect the relevant information. If I didn't do it the first time, I owe it to the person to do it a second time and a third if need be. Usually you don't need to. So I don't think that there is a right answer to that question. It's depend on the particular candidate.
So when you say second time, does it mean you bring them back second time or just extend the time and try to get the information out of them?
If I have time, I will extend it. But again, this was a startup, which means that I can be a little bit more flexible with the hours. That may not necessarily apply for a large company like Shopify or maybe even Ritual for all I know. But if you can, and you feel like it's right, feel free to. Now, after like 3 hours, the person might start getting tired. Make sure that they get some. So there's a bunch of tiny rules that I sort of didn't mention. Things like, make sure that they have water, go to the washroom if they need to. Another one is let them know before the interview process what the interview process is going to be like. That's another good one to do. These are kind of like general knowledge, but it was getting bloated otherwise. Can I think of any others? So if the person is okay to go another half hour, maybe even another hour, make sure, as long as you feel comfortable. In front, and then behind you.
It's not like a question, it's more like a comment. For instance, something that I learned from many interviews is like, for instance, as an interviewee, you have to do like the due diligence, like you have to investigate about the company. And also it's not like you have to research about the company, you have to research about if you really like to work there. It's not like, oh, it's a job and I only need a job for money. It's a thing that you are giving value to the company. You have to identify a company where you are like going to feel happy. And this is something that I noticed that also interviewers notice. When you, apart from doing like only the technical interview, you investigate and also ask questions.
Yeah.
It's like turning.
So that's from the perspective of the actual interviewer. Definitely, there's a whole bunch of rules for actually being the candidate. Like some of the stuff that he said. Research the company, make sure that you know what you're getting into, make sure you're going to enjoy it. Make sure the processes are the kinds that you want. I can't see reading that from here.
So if you ask a lot of open-ended questions, how do you distinguish between someone who's exposed to a lot of things versus someone who owns the code? Someone said, I use retrofit to the networking room to store database. Like I use MVVM. Someone can have a lot of exposure to a lot of things, but someone may not be able to own the code like entirely.
So the questions themselves are not what have you used? It's how do you store app data or something like that. So the person isn't just giving you the answer, room or whatever. The person has to explain what they mean by that. In other words, if it's this kind of data, I store using this thing because this is better. Basically, you're trying to get a more full answer out of the person, not just a single word. Now, if the person has some exposure to it, that's a good thing. When you're going to determine whether or not someone actually has an in-depth or depth of understanding of technical stuff is in the deep dive. Everything else is basically just a question of, does this person know how to solve these kinds of problems? Have they actually had exposure to it? I guess the answer to your question then is, you won't know for sure that the person simply hasn't memorized all these things. The odds go down significantly, especially when they have to give contextual answers, not just a word, in the context, you have to give an answer. And if they have that, plus they've deep dived into something to some degree where so this person knows how to develop software, those two together, I think it's okay because the person can gain more expertise in that particular topic on the job. It's kind of like, part of it is anything can technically be faked. If the person has enough foresight, you're just reducing the odds of it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay. How much importance do you give to soft skills, like communication skills, and how do you evaluate during the interview process for the technical?
If I require those skills, then it would be part of the requirements of the job. In other words, it's not just you show up, boy, I hope you're a nice guy. It's this is the kind of particular skill. We need you to have these skills for managing teams or coaching people, for instance, right? That has to be in the requirement. And then I'll ask specific stuff about that, like it was a technical skill. Really, there's no difference between technical skills and soft skills, just the domain that they're applied to. You can ask questions about both. And people do. Like in non-technical roles, how do you think they hire people, right? They ask people questions about those particular topics. And so you can, if you think that's important, right? It all comes down to what you think is important for this particular role. And that might be, in fact, frequently it is, people skills. Does that help? Yeah.
I'm not saying about like nice guy, but more about like how they express their ideas or how they talk about, for example, Rome. Someone like I used Rome, but he can't express how he used it. But you definitely know he knows the domain, but he can't express it. And if the teamwork is pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah. So that might be, for instance, if it's a linguistic barrier, that could be a problem. In fact, so it's a gray area, right? You can require that somebody knows a particular language in order to work in a particular field. It's not considered discrimination so far as I know, if the person can't speak the language. Now, if a person simply can't communicate themselves well, and you haven't put that in as a requirement, I mean, like I've seen a lot of job descriptions that do put that in as a requirement of the job, that you have to be able to communicate with the rest of your team. So I guess the question is, so what's the question exactly? I feel like I'm...
How do you give importance to like communication skills in the team, and how do you innovate during the interviews, for example?
Oh, so I can give my personal experience, but that's not necessarily going to be true for other companies. It's really come up as a problem for me because most of the people that I talk to have had at least a bare minimum to be able to communicate. I actually don't know how to say it because I can't imagine the last time that it happened as a problem. So maybe someone else has experience with this. Sorry?
I think it's kind of what we talked about earlier of like, if you say, well, we're not going to hire you because you have poor communication skills, and the guy comes back and says, well, that wasn't in the job description, then you add it to the job description next time.
Yeah, so you can do that. Now, I'm not sure if you have to put something in the job description to be a quote unquote qualified. Yes, but you might. So one of the things that happens a lot is as you're evaluating people and accepting and rejecting, you might find out, and giving reasons, you might find, oh, this is actually something that I need. Something that I require, and start putting that in the job description. I'll be honest, I haven't encountered the experience, so I don't know. I can only hypothesize as to what I would do. I wish I could help with that. Any thoughts or? Yeah, sorry. Sorry?
Can someone do well in an interview and don't possess like good communication skills?
Well, I suppose so. They can. Like there's language barriers, which is one thing, but then there's, yeah.
I think you have to maybe describe scenarios, how they would deal with it, and like ask them the question, because I think a lot of the soft skill kind of gray areas that cause issue are communication amongst team members and being able to take criticism and feedback and things like that. That like then you find out people freak out or they get, you know, there's an ego or something like that. And like you can kind of root those out, but I guess it's just like maybe have them talk about their experiences and try to create scenarios that would maybe mimic some of the issues you've had.
That's one thing, yeah, for instance, seeing what kind of problems you're having. Another thing to consider is this is not necessarily an interview thing. In other words, it could be more of a managing the team after the fact. A lot of people who quote unquote have poor communication skills are actually just in an environment where they are having difficulty expressing themselves because of the context. Maybe people aren't open to hearing their ideas or something like that. So there might be a management component to that as well, or a teamwork component to that as well. That's the best I can offer. Though you give me something to consider. Thanks. Thanks, Armin. Looks like any other questions? Cool. Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you.